I asked you a question. Who are you and what are you doing here?
We already
Federal
told you.
law enforcement, official business.
Then show me something I can actually verify.
There you go.
No, that's not enough.
Call it in then.
Don't tell me how to do my job.
Nobody's telling you anything. Verify it and move on.
No, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up and come
not
outside.
leaving
Then
this
you're
table.
obstructing.
This is why officers need to know the limits of their authority before they start throwing it around. When a patrol cop stormed into a roadside diner and tried to throw out two men he thought were suspicious drifters, he expected instant compliance. What he got instead was a calm refusal, 2 federal badges on the table, and the exact kind of public mistake that ends careers. Watch how fast the power shifted once his ego got ahead of his training. Before this goes any further, drop where you're watching from. City, state, country, wherever. And if you like stories about power trips getting checked by facts, hit like and subscribe. This one turned ugly fast, and it stayed ugly for the officer who caused it. This started in a diner that looked too ordinary for the kind of mess that was about to happen. It was late morning, local spot, highway traffic coming through, retirees at the counter, a waitress moving fast with coffee refills, a couple of truckers in a back booth. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. The kind of place where people notice strangers, but not enough to make a scene unless someone gave them a reason. 2 men had been sitting in a booth near the front windows for a while. Plain clothes, neutral jackets, no uniforms, no marked vehicles outside. They'd ordered coffee, something small to eat, and they'd barely touched either one after that. They weren't chatting much. They weren't staring at each other. They were watching the parking lot, the road, the entrance, and the reflection off the glass. People in that business always looked like they were doing nothing right up until it mattered. Those men were Deputy U.S. Marshals, Daniel Mercer and Elena Ruiz. They weren't there to eat. They were there because a fugitive tied to a federal warrant was expected to make contact in the lot outside. The diner gave them visibility, cover, and a believable reason to stay parked in one place without drawing attention. Standard surveillance choice: quiet, efficient, low profile. That was the plan. Then somebody in the diner decided the 2 quiet strangers looked wrong. It might have been a customer, might have been somebody behind the counter. Small towns do this all the time. Somebody sees 2 people sitting too long, not smiling enough, not acting familiar enough, and suddenly the whole thing becomes suspicious. Usually that goes nowhere. Sometimes an officer rolls by, asks a question, gets a simple answer, and moves on. That's what should have happened here. Instead, Officer Tyler Kessler walked in ready to dominate the room. He didn't come in curious. He came in aggressive. That mattered. The first few seconds told the whole story. He didn't scan the room and assess. He locked onto the booth immediately. Fast steps, hand already too close to his belt. Voice turned up for the audience. He wanted the room to know he had found the problem, and he was about to solve it. Mercer looked up once and knew what kind of officer this was. Not the cautious kind. Not the kind who asked himself what he might be missing. Kessler was the kind who decided first and investigated later. Bad habit in any job. Dangerous habit in law enforcement. Kessler stopped at the booth and started demanding answers. Identification. Purpose. Why they'd been sitting there. Why they were watching the entrance. Why the owner felt uncomfortable. He didn't ask those questions to gather facts. He asked them like he was already done listening. Mercer stayed seated. Ruiz stayed seated. Both of them kept it calm. They identified themselves as federal law enforcement engaged in official business. They told him there was no threat to the public and no need to disrupt the scene. They told him he could verify through proper channels if he needed confirmation. Clean, professional. Exactly what trained people say when they don't want to blow an active operation in front of a room full of civilians. Kessler didn't hear any of it the way it was said. He heard a challenge. That's where this went bad. Not because he was confused. Confusion can be fixed in 10 seconds. This was ego. He had walked in hot, and now he needed to prove he hadn't overplayed it. Officers like that get themselves in trouble because backing off feels worse to them than being wrong. Ruiz set her badge wallet where he could see it. Mercer did the same. Gold badges, federal credentials, not vague, not hidden, not some last-second reveal. They put the truth right in front of him and gave him a clean exit. All he had to do was pause, verify, lower his voice, and step out of the way. He didn't. He dismissed the badges almost instantly. Called them fake, or not good enough, or not relevant to what he called his scene. Different officers use different wording when they panic in public, but the move is always the same. Reject the evidence. Keep control of the moment. Don't let anybody see the doubt starting to creep in. The body camera would matter later because it caught that exact shift. You could see it. The second he realized they might actually be who they said they were, he got more forceful, not less. That's the tell. A disciplined officer slows down when uncertainty enters the picture. An insecure one speeds up. Mercer gave him another out. He repeated that verification could happen through dispatch. He explained in measured terms that they were on federal business and that removing them from the diner would interfere with an active investigation. Again, simple. Again, professional. Again, offering Kessler a chance to save face without blowing up the situation. Kessler took it personally. He started threatening obstruction. He started talking about trespass. He started acting like the diner booth was some kind of local battlefield where only his authority counted. That's what power trips look like in real time. They stop being about safety. They become emotional. The officer wants obedience more than accuracy, and the room felt it. Boom. The waitress stopped moving as fast. One of the truckers turned fully around in his seat. The owner looked nervous now, not because of the marshals, but because the officer had turned a manageable question into a public confrontation. A customer near the register started recording without making a show of it. Smart move. People have learned. When an officer comes in too loud and too certain, records matter. Mercer and Ruiz still didn't match his energy. That's another thing that made Kessler look worse. He was the only person escalating. The only person making it bigger. The only person refusing a normal off-ramp. He ordered them to stand up. They refused, not dramatically, not physically. They simply held position and repeated that they were engaged in official federal work and that his demand was improper. That kind of refusal hits an officer like Kessler harder than shouting ever could. He wanted a scene he could win. What he got was calm resistance backed by law, policy, and credentials he was too arrogant to verify. Then he made the mistake that changed the whole case. He radioed for backup and framed the situation like he was dealing with two non-compliant, suspicious subjects, possibly impersonating law enforcement. That was reckless for a few reasons. First, it contaminated the response. Now other officers were arriving with the wrong story in their heads. Second, it raised the stakes in a room full of civilians, while a federal surveillance operation was still active. Third, it created a recorded trail, dispatch logs, body cam, radio traffic, timestamps. Every bad decision now had a timestamp attached to it. Once that happens, cleanup gets hard. Ruiz tried one more time to stop the train before it hit the wall. She told him he was interfering with a Marshals operation. She told him he needed a supervisor before he made this worse. That wasn't a bluff. That was the last warning. Kessler didn't take it as a warning. He took it as disrespect. That was the moment his mask came off. He started talking like one of those officers who confuses a badge with ownership, like the town belonged to him, like jurisdiction was whatever he said it was. Like procedure only mattered when it protected his authority, not when it limited it. This happens more than departments like to admit. Training teaches one thing, ego teaches another. On a bad day, ego wins. And here's what made it even dumber. Mercer and Ruiz weren't trying to embarrass him. Not yet. They were trying to get through the assignment. They had no reason to flex, no reason to posture. The whole point of plainclothes surveillance is to stay invisible. Kessler forced the issue because He couldn't stand the idea that two quiet people at a diner didn't instantly answer to him. By the time the first backup unit pulled into the lot, the atmosphere inside had changed completely. Now it wasn't just a local officer bothering two strangers. Now it was a documented local federal confrontation inside a public business, with witnesses, video, radio traffic, and an officer who had already ignored visible credentials and doubled down anyway. That's when the real danger started. Because once more uniforms walked in, this could either get corrected immediately or become a career-ending disaster. And the person who decided that wasn't going to be Kessler anymore. It was going to be his supervisor. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach. The refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Haley let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement, active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly, no hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification. More than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene, pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His body cam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach, the refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Hale let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement. Active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly. No hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification more than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His body cam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover.
Fake credentials look fake to me. Don't try to fool me. You're under arrest.
They're valid. I identified myself. You still haven't told me what law I'm breaking.
I don't need fake credentials.
Fake? Come on, man.
Valid. Put your hands behind your back. You have
Want to
to
arrest me because I'm black? That's why it seems suspicious to you?
This is why you need to know your rights. Officer Brandon Keller stopped a black man in uptown Charlotte and expected a quick, easy detention. What he got instead was a calm legal challenge from an FBI special agent who knew exactly what the officer could and could not do. The stop was recorded, reviewed, and it ended up exposing a pattern the department had ignored for years. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you follow stories about abuse of authority, legal accountability, and public exposure, like the video and subscribe. This started on a Friday evening in uptown Charlotte. The area was busy. Restaurants were filling up. People were heading to dinner, leaving offices, and moving through the sidewalks like they did every weekend. Daniel Navarro was one of them. He was walking to meet a colleague for dinner. He was not hiding, running, or bothering anyone. Brandon Keller stopped him anyway. Keller had been with the Charlotte Police Department for 6 years. By that point, he already had a history. Complaint after complaint had followed him, many tied to aggressive stops and profiling concerns. The department had noticed. That much became clear later. But instead of removing him from patrol or treating the pattern like a serious warning, supervisors kept giving him light corrections and sending him back out. That matters because this stop did not come out of nowhere. Keller had done versions of this before. He had already learned that the department was not going to stop him in any real way. When Keller approached Navarro, he demanded identification and claimed Navarro matched a vague description. That was the reason he gave. But he did not clearly explain what crime had happened, what specific suspect he was looking for, or what Navarro had done to justify being detained. Navarro did not argue for the sake of arguing. He stayed calm and asked the right question. He asked what law he was breaking. Keller did not have a clear answer. That should have ended the stop. It should have forced Keller to step back and move on. Instead, he pushed forward. He repeated the demand for identification and acted like the stop was already justified just because he had started it. Navarro still did not give him the reaction he wanted. He did not get loud. He did not panic. He did not give Keller anything he could use later to make the stop look reasonable. He stayed controlled and kept the issue where it belonged. What was the legal reason for the detention? Then Navarro identified himself as an FBI special agent. He showed valid credentials, real credentials. That gave Keller a chance to correct himself. He could have checked them, realized he had gone too far, and ended the encounter before it got worse. He did not do that. Keller said the credentials were fake. That was the point where the stop moved from questionable to serious. A local officer had stopped a man without clear cause, failed to explain the legal basis, and then refused to accept valid federal credentials because backing down would mean admitting he had been wrong. Keller then grabbed Navarro and tried to force the stop into an arrest. People nearby started paying attention. It was a public sidewalk in a busy part of the city. A confrontation like that was not going to stay unnoticed. Witnesses slowed down. Some stopped completely. Then phones came out. That changed the situation. Once bystanders started recording, Keller was no longer just dealing with Navarro. He was creating a record of his own conduct. His words, his tone, his lack of justification, the physical escalation. All of it was now being captured by people who had no reason to protect him. Navarro stayed composed. That was important. Keller was trying to control the scene through pressure. Navarro kept forcing the issue back to the law. He had done nothing suspicious. Keller could not explain a valid basis for detention. The credentials were real. The arrest attempt had no legal support. The more Keller pushed, the worse it looked. And this was not just about one bad decision in one moment. The reason this incident mattered so much is that Keller had already built a pattern. Internal records later showed He had received 11 complaints in 6 years. Many involved similar stops of black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. Same kind of target, same kind of setting, same aggressive approach. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern. They just had not acted in a meaningful way. That background was not visible to the crowd on the sidewalk yet, but it was already part of the story. Keller was acting like a man who had been allowed to do this before. Then Sergeant Linda Mercer arrived. She stepped into a scene that was already tense and already public. She saw Keller, Navarro, the witnesses, and the phones recording. She checked the credentials. She looked at what witnesses had captured. It did not take long to understand that Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis, and then escalated after being challenged. At that point, Keller's version was falling apart in real time. Sergeant Linda Mercer did not treat it like a misunderstanding. She treated it like a scene that needed to be checked fast and documented correctly. She looked at Navarro's credentials herself. They were valid. She listened to the basic sequence of events. She checked what witnesses had already recorded. The problem was obvious. Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis, rejected valid identification, and escalated to physical force when he could not justify the detention. Mercer shut it down. She ordered Keller away from Navarro and took control of the stop. That mattered. Keller had been trying to keep the situation inside his own version of events. Mercer broke that immediately. Once another supervisor stepped in, checked the credentials, and saw the witness video, Keller lost control of the scene. Navarro was released there on the spot. That ended the street confrontation, but it started the real problem for the department. By that point, several bystanders had clear footage. It showed Navarro staying calm. It showed Keller pressing the stop without explaining a valid reason. It showed the situation getting worse instead of better after Navarro identified himself. Keller had no clean way to explain that video. The department did not have a clean way to defend it either. Keller was suspended almost immediately. That quick suspension told its own story. Departments usually move fast only when the facts are bad, public, and easy to understand. This one checked all 3 boxes. A federal agent had been stopped without cause in a busy part of Charlotte. Witnesses had recorded it. A supervisor had confirmed on scene that the credentials were real. There was no room to turn it into a vague internal dispute. Then the background started coming out. Once internal reviewers and city attorneys looked deeper, they found that Keller was not a surprise problem. He was a repeated problem. He had already collected 11 complaints in 6 years. Many of those complaints involved stops with the same basic pattern: black professionals, upscale or business districts, weak reasons for detention, aggressive behavior once challenged. That changed the meaning of the whole incident. Now, it was not just about one officer making one unlawful stop. It was about why he was still in position to do it after so many warnings. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern long before Navarro was stopped in uptown Charlotte. Internal records showed that leadership knew Keller's name, knew the complaint history, and knew the types of allegations tied to him. They responded with minor training and no serious discipline. That is how departments create their own scandals. They do not always create them by defending bad conduct after the fact. Sometimes they create them much earlier by tolerating it over and over until the wrong officer picks the wrong target in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Keller had picked the worst possible target for a bad stop. Navarro was not just someone who knew his rights in a general sense. He worked in federal law enforcement. He understood detention standards. He understood how reports get written. He understood how civil rights cases are built. He also understood that a calm record is stronger than an angry argument. So he did what experienced people do when a system shows its hand. He documented everything and moved it to a forum where Keller could not control the facts. The witness video spread quickly, first local, then wider. People in Charlotte started reacting not just to the stop itself, but to the pattern behind it. Black professionals spoke about similar encounters. Residents recognized the location type immediately. Upscale areas, business areas, places where certain officers treated black presence as suspicion by default. That public reaction mattered because it showed the department was dealing with more than one complaint from one victim. The video gave other people a reference point. It made older complaints look less isolated and more credible. Once that happens, leadership loses one of its favorite excuses. They can no longer pretend each case stood alone. Inside the department, supervisors had another problem. Mercer's intervention had made it harder to bury the details. This was not an incident where everyone on scene backed Keller's version. A sergeant had already stepped in, checked the credentials, and seen that Keller's basis for the stop did not hold together. That meant the city would have to account not only for what Keller did, but for what Mercer had already recognized in real time. And once lawyers got involved, that became very expensive. Because civil rights cases do not stop at the officer if the facts show a pattern. They move up. They ask who knew. They ask when they knew it. They ask what they did after repeated complaints. They ask why an officer with that record was still on patrol doing the same kind of stop. Those questions are harder for a department to answer than the stop itself. Navarro filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Keller, Keller's supervisors, and the Charlotte Police Department. That filing forced the issue out of internal language and into legal language. Internal language gives departments space. Legal language strips that away. A complaint is no longer a workplace matter or a training issue. It becomes a record of alleged constitutional violations, supervisory failure, and institutional neglect. The city then had to look at the full risk. Not just the video, not just Keller's actions, the history, the prior complaints, the notice to supervisors, the failure to intervene earlier, the public setting, the credibility of the victim, the fact that Mercer had confirmed the stop was wrong before the scene even ended. That is where the department's real exposure was sitting. Keller had created the incident. Leadership had created the conditions for it to happen again and again. That is the part many departments hate the most, because it is harder to isolate. Firing one officer later does not erase years of warnings. It does not erase ignored complaint patterns. It does not erase decisions by supervisors who saw the risk and kept him on patrol anyway. By then, Keller's career was already collapsing. Suspension was only the start. The evidence against him was too direct, and his history made it worse instead of softer. What might have been called a disputed stop in another case now looked like part of a documented pattern, and the department could see where this was headed. The department could see where it was headed, but by then it was too late to contain it. Navarro's lawsuit put the whole chain under pressure. Not just Keller, his supervisors too. The complaint argued that Keller violated Navarro's civil rights during the stop, then tried to force an arrest without legal grounds. It also went after the people above him for allowing an officer with a known pattern of misconduct to stay on patrol. That second part was the real danger for the city. A bad stop by one officer is damaging. A bad stop tied to years of ignored warnings is worse. Once internal records showed Keller had already drawn 11 complaints in 6 years, the issue got much bigger than one Friday night in uptown Charlotte. The case now had a timeline. It had repeated notice. It had a pattern supervisors had every chance to address and chose not to stop in any serious way. That is how the city ended up settling. The settlement was $4 million. Cities do not pay that kind of money because of a simple misunderstanding. They pay when the facts are hard to defend, the record is bad, and the risk of going further is even worse. In this case, the city was looking at witness video, a federal agent with valid credentials, a stop with no clear legal basis, an attempted arrest that did not hold up, and a complaint history that made Keller impossible to describe as an isolated problem. Keller was fired, He also lost his certification, which ended his ability to work in law enforcement again. That part mattered. Departments sometimes remove officers quietly and leave the door open for them to land somewhere else. This case did not end that way. Keller did not just lose one job. He lost the authority that came with the badge. But the story did not stop with him, and it should not. Keller was the visible problem. The deeper problem sat above him. Supervisors had already seen enough to act. They had the complaints. They had the recurring allegations. They had the location pattern, the type of stops, and the repeated accusations involving black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. They knew enough to understand the risk. They chose soft responses anyway. That failure became part of the public reckoning. The fallout forced changes inside the department. Complaint review systems were tightened, so repeated allegations could not be brushed aside as separate, unrelated incidents. Early warning tracking was strengthened to flag officers who kept drawing the same types of complaints. Outside oversight was added so the department was not left to police its own patterns in private. Public reporting requirements were also put in place, which made it harder to bury warning signs behind internal language. That is what real pressure does. It forces systems to create records they cannot easily hide later. And this is the point people should pay attention to. Keller did not suddenly become reckless on the night he stopped Navarro. He had been given room to operate like that for years. The stop in uptown Charlotte became a scandal because it finally happened in a setting the department could not control. Wrong target, public location, witnesses recording, immediate supervisory review, federal lawsuit, financial consequences. That combination forced honesty. Navarro's role in that mattered too. He did not save himself by shouting louder than Keller. He did not try to win the moment with attitude. He stayed controlled, stayed clear, and kept the issue tied to the law. Then he moved the fight to the place where records, patterns, and accountability mattered more than one officer's version of events. That is usually where these cases are really decided. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the first report. In the record that follows. By the end of it, Keller lost his career. The city paid millions. The department was pushed into reforms it should have made long before Navarro was ever stopped. And the public got a clear view of what the real issue was. Not one bad choice by one officer on one night. A system saw repeated misconduct, recognized the pattern, and let it continue until exposure made inaction impossible. That is the lesson here. A lot of abuse survives because institutions protect it through delay, excuses, and weak internal discipline. It keeps going until somebody documents it well enough, challenges it clearly enough, and forces the cost into public view. That is what happened here. So, what would you have done in Navarro's position? Have you ever seen a situation where an official kept pushing only because they were used to nobody stopping them? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories like this.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Wait, why?
You didn't stop, you kept going.
I slowed down and pulled to
Stop
the light.
talking, turn around.
I'm not trying to fight you, I'm trying to explain.
Ethan,
It's okay, stay in the car.
This is why people need to understand their rights before a bad stop turns into a life-changing one. Broward County Deputy Ryan Mercer thought he was dealing with two scared teenagers he could pressure into silence on the side of the road. He did not expect the facts to start working against him almost immediately. And he definitely did not expect this stop to end with a lawsuit, a multi-million-dollar settlement, and his career blown apart. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of power, legal accountability, and people keeping calm when an officer gets out of line, like this video, and subscribe. By the time the stop got serious, Ethan Carter was already in handcuffs, and his sister Maya was sitting in the car in shock. That's how fast it happened. Ethan was a high school student on his way to school with his younger sister. It was a normal morning in Broward County. He was driving. She was in the passenger seat. Nothing about that drive suggested they were about to get pulled into a police stop that would later cost the county $2 million. The problem started with something simple. Deputy Ryan Mercer wanted Ethan to stop, but he did not start with a clear traffic stop. He had no lights on, no siren, no unmistakable signal that any driver would immediately read as a command to pull over. He used a hand motion. Ethan saw that gesture and understood it as a signal to move over or change lanes. So he did exactly that. He kept driving in a normal way because he thought he had followed the instruction. That misunderstanding should have been easy to fix. A competent officer in that situation turns on the lights, hits the siren, makes the stop clear, and then figures out whether the driver was confused or refusing to comply. That is basic. Mercer did not handle it that way. He waited until later to activate the siren. The second Ethan heard it and realized this was an actual stop, he pulled over. That should have settled the issue. It should have become a routine traffic stop with a short explanation. Ethan could have told him he misunderstood the hand signal. Mercer could have checked the license, written a warning or citation if he wanted, and moved on. Instead, Mercer treated the stop like Ethan had committed a felony. He moved in aggressively, pulled Ethan out of the car, handcuffed him, and accused him of fleeing. He did not slow the situation down. He did not ask basic questions first. He did not give Ethan room to explain what had happened before turning physical. That decision changed everything. Now, this was no longer a traffic misunderstanding. Now a teenager on his way to school was standing on the roadside in handcuffs while a deputy pushed a felony accusation that did not match the facts. Ethan tried to explain. He said he did not know Mercer wanted him to stop earlier. He said he thought the hand motion meant move over, not pull over. He said he stopped as soon as the siren came on. Mercer did not listen. That matters because this is where officers either correct a mistake or make it worse. Mercer had enough information to realize Ethan's explanation made sense. There had been no lights or siren at first. The driver had stopped once the stop became clear. There was no obvious sign of panic, no wild driving, no effort to get away. But Mercer had already decided he was dealing with felony flight. And once he locked himself into that position, he treated Ethan's explanation like a challenge instead of evidence. Maya was watching all of this from the passenger seat. She saw her brother pulled out of the car and cuffed on the way to school. She heard the deputy talking to him like he was some dangerous suspect. At that point, she stopped thinking this was a misunderstanding that would clear itself up. She understood something was wrong, so she called their mother. That call made Mercer even more hostile. Their mother was Danielle Carter, a federal judge. Maya reached out because she needed help, and because the stop had already gone beyond anything that looked normal. Once Mercer found out who was on the phone, he did not calm down and make sure every step he took was legally solid. He got more aggressive. That told everyone exactly what kind of stop this had become. He argued with their mother on the phone instead of sticking to the facts of the stop. He turned the situation personal. Then he took Maya's phone even though she was not a threat and was not creating any danger. That was a major mistake. Maya was a frightened teenager calling her mother while her brother was in handcuffs. Taking her phone did not make the scene safer. It did not help Mercer investigate anything. It showed he wanted control more than clarity, and the facts were already moving against him. There was no legal basis for treating Ethan like a fleeing felon. Ethan had not taken off after a clearly marked stop. He had not ignored lights and siren. He had not kept driving after the stop became unmistakable. He pulled over once Mercer activated the siren. On top of that, there was no criminal issue on his license that explained some desperate attempt to escape. Mercer was trying to force a serious charge onto a situation that did not support it. Ethan stayed focused and kept giving the same explanation. He had misunderstood the gesture. He had not run. He had stopped when the siren came on. Mercer had a problem now. The longer he held onto the felony story, the worse it looked. Every minute made it harder to explain why he had skipped normal procedure and gone straight to force. At some point, he had to back off. He removed the handcuffs. That move made one thing clear. Mercer could not support the arrest he had started. If Ethan had really fled from a lawful stop, that case would not disappear on the roadside after a few checks and a few minutes of pressure. Mercer had gone too far and knew it. But he still did not admit it. Instead, he wrote a citation. That was not a real fix. It was an attempt to leave the scene with something official in his hand after the felony accusation fell apart. Ethan and Maya were still left with the same reality. Ethan had been yanked out of the car, cuffed, and accused of a felony on the way to school. Maya had been frightened, cut off from her mother, and forced to watch the whole thing happen. A citation did not undo any of that. By the time the stop ended, both teenagers understood they had just been through something far more serious than an officer losing his temper for a minute. This was abuse of authority dressed up as enforcement. And Mercer had made another mistake he probably did not appreciate yet. He had created a stop that could be checked from every direction. The timing of the signals, the lack of lights and siren at the start, Ethan stopping once the siren came on, the handcuffs, the felony accusation, the phone call with their mother, the seizure of Maya's phone, the final retreat from arrest to citation. That kind of stop does not stay buried if the family has the means and the discipline to challenge it. The Carters did. Once they got home and laid out what happened step by step, this was no longer just a bad morning on the road. It was the beginning of a case that would put Mercer's decisions under a microscope and force Broward County to answer for what he did. Once the Carter family got home, they did not treat this like a bad traffic stop that would fade after a few angry conversations. They treated it like a case. That was the right move. A lot of people lose these situations before they even begin because they rely on outrage instead of structure. They tell the story emotionally, skip details, and leave room for the officer's report to become the official version. The Carters did the opposite. They started locking down the timeline. Ethan explained the drive from the beginning. He described the first moment he noticed Mercer, the hand motion, what he thought it meant, and the point when the siren finally came on. Maya filled in what she saw from the passenger seat. She described the stop from her angle, Ethan getting pulled out, the handcuffs, Mercer's tone, the phone call to their mother, and Mercer taking her phone. Their mother already knew what mattered. Not assumptions, not dramatic language, sequence. Exact actions, exact timing. What signal came first? When Ethan pulled over, what Mercer said the basis was. When the handcuffs went on, when they came off. Why Maya's phone got taken. What citation got written after the felony claim collapsed. That's how a weak police narrative starts falling apart, piece by piece. Danielle Carter also understood something else. A deputy can say a driver fled. That does not make it true. If the stop began with no lights, no siren, and only a vague hand motion, the whole legal theory gets shaky fast. If the driver then pulls over once the siren comes on, it gets even worse for the deputy. If the deputy reacts by escalating, grabbing, cuffing, and pushing a felony accusation without solid grounds, then the department has a serious problem. The family moved quickly, and they preserved everything they could. Notes, call history, the citation, their own memory while it was still fresh. That mattered because details disappear fast after adrenaline wears off. People start rounding things off. Times blur together. Sequences get less precise. The Carters did not let that happen. Then they pushed the complaint forward. This is where a lot of departments hope people get tired. They count on families backing off after the first emotional crash. They count on fear, delay, and the usual feeling that fighting law enforcement is too expensive, too slow, too stacked against normal people. Mercer probably thought this would end that way too. He had the badge. He had the first shot at the report. He had the usual advantage officers get when a roadside stop turns into paperwork. But this was not a family that was going to let a false version settle into the record. The internal review process started with the same basic issue Mercer should have solved on the roadside. What exactly made him think Ethan had committed felony fleeing? That question did not help him, because now he had to explain why a hand motion without lights or siren was supposed to count as a clear command to stop. He had to explain why Ethan pulling over once the siren came on did not end the matter. He had to explain why he jumped past ordinary traffic stop procedure and went straight to force. He had to explain why Maya's phone got taken. He had to explain why the stop ended with a citation instead of the felony arrest he had acted out in real time. The more people looked at it, the worse it got. That is usually how these cases work. The stop may look confusing in the moment, because one side has all the authority and all the pressure is flowing one way. Later, once the emotion gets stripped out and the sequence gets reviewed, the bad decisions start standing alone. Clean. Hard to defend? Mercer had made several. First, he failed to make the stop clear at the start. That set up the misunderstanding. Second, once Ethan stopped after the siren, Mercer treated the earlier confusion like proof of criminal intent, instead of checking whether the explanation fit the facts. Third, he escalated physically before establishing a sound legal basis for the arrest posture he was taking. Fourth, he made the stop worse after learning who their mother was. That part was especially ugly because it suggested this was no longer about enforcement. It was about pride. Fifth, he grabbed Maya's phone even though she posed no threat. Each one of those decisions had its own problem. Together, they painted a very bad picture. The family's legal team saw it the same way. This was not just a bad judgment call. It was a false arrest and an excessive force claim with emotional distress consequences built into the facts. Ethan had been handcuffed and accused of a felony without a lawful basis. Maya had been aggressively detained in the middle of an already chaotic stop and cut off from her mother, even though she had done nothing wrong. That is how a traffic stop becomes civil liability. And once lawyers get involved, officers lose one big advantage. They no longer get to rely on tone and presence. Nobody cares about roadside swagger in a lawsuit. The case becomes documents, testimony, policy, timing, and whether the officer's story still holds together when every step gets tested. Mercer's did not. The complaint laid out the core issue clearly. Ethan had not fled. He had misunderstood an unclear gesture before any lights or siren were used. He stopped once the siren came on. Mercer then used force without proper justification, escalated the situation, and interfered with Maya while she was trying to contact their mother during a stop that was already out of control. That is a strong case because it does not rely on exaggeration. It relies on sequence, and sequence is hard to spin. The county had to look at more than Mercer's initial claim now. They had to think about what a jury would see if this went all the way. 2 students on a school commute, a deputy using a vague gesture instead of a clear stop, a siren coming later, a teenager pulling over once the stop became obvious, immediate handcuffing, a felony accusation that did not match the facts, a sister calling her mother in fear, a federal judge on the phone, the deputy getting more hostile, not less. Then the retreat from arrest to citation. That story had a very obvious weakness. It made Mercer look like he was trying to force the facts to fit his reaction. Departments hate cases like that because they are hard to clean up. And there was another problem for Mercer. Even if someone wanted to defend the initial misunderstanding as a split-second judgment issue, the later decisions kept making things worse. He had opportunities to correct course. More than one. He did not take them. That matters in these cases. A single bad read can sometimes be explained. Repeated escalation after new facts come in is harder to excuse. Ethan and Maya also had to deal with the personal side while all this was building. That part gets overlooked a lot, but it matters. Ethan still had to go back to school after being treated like a criminal on the way there. Maya still had to live with the memory of watching her brother cuffed while an armed deputy took over the scene. These stops do not end when the patrol car leaves. They stay with people. The embarrassment stays. The anger stays. The change in how safe, ordinary things feel stays. The family did not let that part get minimized. They made clear that this was not only about a bad charge or an improper citation. It was about what Mercer did to two teenagers during a routine morning and what that kind of conduct does to a person after the scene is over. That raised the stakes. Now, the county was not just looking at whether Mercer had made a technical error. They were looking at false arrest, excessive force, emotional distress, and a fact pattern that could play very badly in public if it ever moved beyond legal filings and into wider attention. Mercer was no longer controlling the story. That shift matters. On the roadside, he had total control. He controlled the tone, the movement, the pressure, and the immediate consequences. Afterward, control started moving away from him. Into records, into policy review, into legal claims, into a setting where authority means less than proof, and proof was becoming a problem for him. By this point, the family was not asking whether they should act. They were already acting. The real question was how far this would go, and whether Broward County would fight the case or try to make it disappear before more damage hit the department. Because once the paperwork, testimony, and review started lining up, one thing was becoming clear. Ryan Mercer had turned a simple misunderstanding into a case that could cost the county a lot of money and cost him his job. The lawsuit forced the county to deal with the stop as it actually happened, not as Mercer tried to frame it on the roadside. The main issue was simple. Ethan did not flee. Mercer had not made a clear stop at first. He used a hand motion without lights or siren. Ethan read that as a signal to change lanes and kept going. Once the siren came on, he pulled over. That sequence destroyed the felony theory. Mercer had treated confusion as intent. That was the first major problem. The second was what he did after Ethan stopped. Instead of handling it like a traffic stop, he pulled Ethan out, handcuffed him, and accused him of a felony. By the end of the stop, he had to remove the cuffs because there was no solid basis for that arrest posture. Then there was Maya. She called their mother because she was scared by what Mercer was doing. Mercer responded by arguing on the phone and taking Maya's phone even though she was not a threat. That made the stop worse and widened the case. The family sued over false arrest, excessive force, and emotional distress. Those claims fit the facts. Ethan had been detained like a fleeing suspect without legal grounds. Maya had been aggressively controlled during a stop where she had done nothing wrong. The county had to look at the full sequence, and the full sequence was bad for Mercer. His actions created a clear pattern. He misread the situation, escalated too fast, refused to correct himself, then tried to leave the scene with a citation after the felony accusation fell apart. That did not hold up. The case ended with a $3 million settlement for Ethan and Maya. Mercer was fired for gross misconduct. That outcome settled the core issue. Ethan was not a student who ran from police. He was a student wrongly arrested after a deputy turned a misunderstanding into a power move. Maya was not just standing nearby. What Mercer did to her counted too. The settlement closed the legal case, but it also made the result public, in the only way that really matters in cases like this. The county paid $3 million to Ethan and Maya Carter. That number mattered because it showed the case was serious. This was not treated like a minor stop or a small judgment error. The county was paying for false arrest, excessive force, and the harm Mercer caused both teenagers during a routine school drive. Mercer was also fired for gross misconduct. That ended the other argument too. He was not leaving this as a deputy who made a tough call under pressure. He lost his job because his conduct could not be defended once the facts were reviewed in order. For Ethan, the result corrected the record. He was never a fleeing suspect. He was a student who misunderstood an unclear hand motion, stopped once the siren came on, and got treated like a felon by a deputy who refused to slow down and assess the situation properly. For Maya, the outcome mattered because what happened to her was recognized as part of the abuse, not some extra detail around Ethan's stop. She was frightened, aggressively controlled, and had her phone taken even though she was not a threat. That is what made this case bigger than one bad stop. Mercer had all the power at the start. He had the badge, the roadside control, and the ability to force his version in real time. The Carters beat that by doing the opposite of what he expected. They stayed calm, kept the sequence straight, and challenged every part of the story that did not match the facts. That is why this case still matters. A deputy tried to turn confusion into felony flight. He tried to use force to hold that version together. He failed because the timeline was clear, the family acted fast, and the law did not support what he did. That is the lesson here. Knowing your rights does not always stop abuse in the moment, but it can stop abuse from becoming the official story afterward. What would you have done if you were Ethan or Maya in that car? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
What's the reason?
We got a call, and I assume you're too
A
suspicious.
call for what exactly? What did you personally observe?
Sir, you're under arrest for not cooperating. Hands behind your back.
This is a picnic. You're doing this because I wouldn't just say.
This is why people need to understand their rights before a police encounter gets out of control. Officers surrounded a family during a weekend picnic and acted like they were dealing with a threat, but the father knew exactly how far police authority could legally go. The stop looked routine for about a minute. Then it turned into a serious mistake with witnesses, recordings, and a chain of decisions that would later be impossible to explain away. If you're watching, comment where you're from. If you care about real accountability, when officers push past the law, like the video, and subscribe. It happened at a public park in a suburban city on a normal weekend afternoon. Families were spread across the grass. Kids were near the playground. Some people were walking dogs, others were eating lunch, and nothing in the area suggested any kind of danger or disorder. The family at the center of the incident had a blanket, food containers, drinks for the children, and a small speaker playing quietly. The father was helping one child with a kite, while the mother was arranging lunch. Everything about the scene was ordinary. Then several patrol vehicles entered the lot. That already told people nearby this was not being handled as a casual check. When multiple officers arrive at once, the tone changes before anyone even speaks. The officers got out with purpose and walked directly towards the family. They were not scanning the area to figure out what had happened. They were moving as if they had already decided this family was the problem. The reason for the response was a weak complaint dressed up as something more serious. Dispatch had received a suspicious activity call about a family near the playground. The caller claimed the adults were making others uncomfortable and possibly arguing with people in the area. It was vague, and that mattered. Calls like that often reflect bias, exaggeration, or simple annoyance rather than actual criminal conduct. Any officer who arrived and looked at the situation objectively should have recognized that fast. The sergeant who led the contact did not. He focused on the father almost immediately. He did not start with broad questions to find out what had happened. He did not ask nearby park-goers whether there had been any actual disturbance. He approached like he already believed the complaint and only needed the father to confirm it somehow. The father stood up as the officers approached. He kept his hands visible and asked a direct question about what the issue was. The sergeant gave him a vague answer about a complaint and park safety. The father then asked what specific conduct had led to the stop. That should not have been a difficult question. If police are approaching someone based on suspicious activity, they should be able to describe what that suspicious activity actually was. The sergeant did not do that. He stayed general and acted like the request for clarity was itself a problem. The mother stayed close to the children and watched carefully. She was not arguing. She was not interfering. She was trying to keep the situation calm while the officers formed a loose circle around the picnic area. That move changed the scene. What had started as a family outing now looked like a detention in front of strangers. The father asked whether he was free to leave or being detained. That is one of the clearest questions a person can ask in an encounter like this. It forces the officer to define the stop. A professional answer would have narrowed the legal issue right there. Instead, the sergeant avoided the question and told him to step away from the blanket. The father asked again whether he was under lawful detention. The sergeant repeated the command with a sharper tone. That exchange mattered because it showed where the situation was going. The father was trying to establish the legal basis for the encounter. The sergeant was trying to control movement first and explain later. That is where a lot of bad stops start. The officer treats calm questions as defiance and starts escalating because he does not like being challenged. A few people nearby had started watching by then. Some raised their phones and began recording. The father did not perform for them or try to turn the moment into a speech. He stayed focused on the same simple points. Why were they being approached? What specific complaint had been made? Were they being detained? What legal grounds supported it? He kept the questions narrow because narrow questions are hard to bury later in a report. The officers then asked for identification. The father asked what crime they were investigating. Again, there was no clean answer. The sergeant relied on broad phrases about an investigation and the need to cooperate. That kind of wording sounds official, but it often hides the fact that the officer has not established a real basis for the detention. By then, the officers had already seen the family, the food, the children, the blanket, and the lack of any threatening behavior. There was still no visible offense, no disturbance, no sign of intoxication, no aggression, nothing that matched the tone of the response. The mother then raised her phone and began recording openly. The sergeant noticed immediately and warned her not to interfere. She was standing with her children and documenting the stop. That was lawful. Her decision to record made the officers more cautious in some ways, but it also seemed to irritate the sergeant. He was now dealing with a father asking precise legal questions and a mother preserving the entire interaction on video. That combination often exposes sloppy policing in real time. The father repeated his question about whether he was being detained. This time, the sergeant said he was being detained, while officers sorted things out. That sounded procedural, but it was legally weak. Police cannot detain someone just to sort things out unless they can point to facts supporting reasonable suspicion of a crime. The father understood that immediately and asked what specific facts justified the detention. The sergeant did not have a strong answer. He shifted to officer safety language. That was not supported by the scene either. The father had not threatened anyone. He had not reached into pockets, made sudden movements, or tried to leave. He had simply stood near his family and asked lawful questions in a public park. Another officer stepped closer and reached for the father's arm. The mother responded by pulling the children back and keeping the phone trained on the officers. She did not rush forward. She did not create a physical confrontation. She stated clearly that her husband was not resisting and that the stop was being recorded. That was smart. Clear audio from a calm witness often becomes more valuable than the video itself. The father did not pull away or give the officers anything they could later describe as resistance. He let the scene unfold exactly as they were choosing to create it. The officers then placed him in handcuffs in front of his wife, his children, and several people in the park who were already filming. That changed everything. At that point, this was no longer a vague park inquiry. It was now a public detention of a calm father over an unverified suspicious activity complaint that still had not been explained in concrete terms. One of the children started crying. The mother stayed controlled, but it was obvious she was angry and focused. The sergeant kept insisting they were conducting a lawful detention. The problem for him was simple. He had used force and restraints before clearly establishing facts that would justify either. By then, the officers still believed they were in control of the stop. They had not yet understood who the father was, or how well he understood the law. They also had not thought far enough ahead to realize what multiple recordings, witness statements, body camera footage, and dispatch logs were going to look like once those pieces were reviewed together. The sergeant kept acting like pressure would settle the matter. It wouldn't. Once the officers put the father in handcuffs, the stop became much harder to defend. Up to that point, the sergeant could still pretend he was checking a complaint. After the cuffs went on, every decision had to match a real legal basis. That was where the problem started getting serious. If you're watching, comment your city. If you want more stories about bad stops and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. The father stayed calm. He did not argue for effect. He kept asking the same direct questions. Was he under arrest or only detained? What specific crime were they investigating? What facts gave them grounds to handcuff him in front of his family? The sergeant did not answer clearly. He kept using broad phrases about an investigation and officer safety. That was weak. The officers had arrived to a family picnic, not a fight, not a threat, not a crime in progress. The wife kept recording. She said clearly that her husband had not resisted and that officers still had not identified an actual offense. A couple of people nearby recorded from different angles. That mattered because the scene was now documented from several sources, not just police body cams. The sergeant then had another officer move the father away from the blanket and closer to the patrol cars. That made the detention look even worse. The children were already upset, and now they were watching their father being separated from them over a complaint nobody could explain properly. The father kept pressing the same point. He asked whether the detention was based on officer observations, a witness statement, or just his refusal to obey commands that had no clear legal basis. The sergeant had no strong answer. He started talking more, but the content stayed thin. Then one of the officers asked for identification again. This time the father agreed and provided it carefully. The younger officer checked the ID, looked back at the father, then looked at the sergeant. His body language changed immediately. He checked it again to make sure he had read it right. The father was a sitting federal judge. That was the moment the stop changed. The sergeant stepped in, looked at the identification, and understood the situation at once. His tone dropped. His posture changed. He was still trying to look in control, but the confidence was gone. A minute earlier, he had acted like the father was just another person he could pressure. Now he knew the man in handcuffs understood constitutional law better than anyone on scene. The father did not raise his voice. He did not grandstand. He simply laid out the problem. He said they had detained him without clearly stating a crime, handcuffed him without a real safety basis, and treated a lawful family picnic like suspicious conduct because somebody made a vague complaint. He made it clear that discomfort from a caller did not automatically create police authority. The wife kept filming the officers as they reacted. That part was important too. Once police realize who a person is and suddenly change tone, it raises an obvious question later. If the stop was lawful before the identification, why did everything shift after it? The sergeant called for a supervisor. That call came late. It also showed he knew the stop was slipping away from him. The children were still shaken. The younger one was crying. The older one stayed close to the mother and watched everything. The wife then asked whether her husband would have been treated the same way if he had not known the law and if she had not recorded the stop from the start. Nobody answered that. A supervisor arrived a short time later. He took one look at the father in cuffs, the wife filming, the kids upset, and the people nearby recording. He could see this was already bad. The sergeant started explaining, but the explanation was short and it did not sound strong enough for what officers had already done. The father then broke the stop down in plain term: public park, no visible offense, no clear, reasonable suspicion. escalation after lawful questions, handcuffs without a credible safety reason. It was simple and hard to argue with. The supervisor listened, looked at the scene again, and made the only decision left. He ordered the cuffs removed. Once the cuffs came off, the officers lost the argument that this had been a clean detention. Taking the cuffs off that fast did not solve the problem. It showed the problem was real. If you're watching, drop your city in the comments. If you want more stories where bad decisions meet real scrutiny, like the video and subscribe. The supervisor stepped in and tried to slow everything down. He asked the father if he was hurt and said they wanted to sort out what had happened. That was an attempt to regain control of the scene before more damage was done on camera. The father did not let the conversation drift. He kept it focused on the main issue. He said the officers had detained him in a public park without clearly identifying a crime, handcuffed him in front of his wife and children, and escalated after he asked basic legal questions. He kept it simple because simple facts are harder to hide later. The supervisor then asked the sergeant what conduct had justified the detention. That was the question that mattered most. Not what dispatch said, not what a caller felt, what the officers themselves had seen after arriving. The answer was weak. The sergeant referred to the complaint, the father's refusal to move when ordered, and general officer safety. None of that sounded strong enough for handcuffs. The father had not threatened anyone. He had not tried to run. He had not acted aggressively. He had stood near his family and asked why police were stopping him. The father then said exactly what the officers did not want said out loud. He said they had turned a vague complaint into a detention first and had started looking for legal justification after that. He said the sequence was obvious. They arrived, focused on his family, escalated, and only then tried to explain it. That was hard to answer because it matched the scene. The wife stepped in next. She asked the supervisor whether all body camera footage would be preserved, whether dispatch audio from the original call would be saved, and whether every officer on scene would be identified in the report. That put the conversation where it belonged, not on feelings, on evidence. The supervisor answered more carefully than the sergeant had. He said the footage would be retained and that the incident would be reviewed. He was speaking like someone who already understood internal affairs was now part of the story. Nearby witnesses were still filming. A few of them had heard enough to understand what had happened. One woman said the father had been calm the whole time. Another witness said the officers had shown up ready to force a problem before they had confirmed there was one. Comments like that matter because they do not come from the family or the department. They come from people with no reason to shape the story for either side. The supervisor then tried to soften the scene by calling it a misunderstanding that escalated too quickly. The father shut that down immediately. He said there had been no misunderstanding on his side. His family had been eating lunch in a public park. Officers arrived and treated that as suspicious without identifying actual unlawful conduct. He said that was not confusion. It was a decision. That distinction mattered. The wife then asked the officers to step back from the children. The supervisor finally told them to widen the space and stop crowding the blanket area. That should have happened much earlier, but it was the first move that actually reduced the pressure around the family. The father then made another point that cut off an easy excuse. He said his title should not matter. He said the stop had to be lawful before the officers knew who he was. That was important because it blocked the department from later framing the case as a special situation involving a prominent person. He was making the opposite point. If the detention was wrong, it was wrong because of what they did to an ordinary family before identification changed the tone. The sergeant had very little to say by then. Earlier, he had controlled the scene. Now he was mostly standing back, while the supervisor handled the fallout. That alone told people a lot. The father requested names, badge numbers, and the incident reference. He also made it clear that dispatch logs, body camera footage, and witness recordings would all matter later. He was not threatening anyone. He was telling them what was obviously coming next. The supervisor gave a short apology for the distress caused. The father did not debate it. He said the department would have a chance to address the stop through formal channels. That answer told the officers this was not ending with a sidewalk apology and a quiet departure. The family packed their things slowly and kept recording until they were ready to leave. That was smart. The stop may have ended, but the evidence gathering had not. By the time they walked away, the officers were no longer dealing with a field contact. They were dealing with a record. After the family left, the park incident moved out of the field and into the system. That was where the officers had a bigger problem. Out in public, they could rely on tone, positioning, and vague commands. In review, none of that helps. Review looks at sequence, legal basis, footage, radio traffic, and written reports. The stop was weak on all of it. If you're watching, comment your city. If you want more real stories about accountability, when authority gets abused, like the video, subscribe, and stay with the channel. The first issue was the call itself. Dispatch records showed a vague, suspicious activity complaint, not a report of violence, theft, threats, or trespassing. That already made the aggressive response look excessive. Then the body camera footage made things worse. The officers arrived to a family picnic, saw no obvious crime, got lawful questions from the father, and escalated anyway. That sequence is hard to defend because it shows the detention grew out of assumption, not clear facts. The second problem was the handcuffing. Once the father was restrained, the department needed a clear explanation for why officers believed that level of force was necessary. The footage did not show aggression. It did not show resistance. It did not show an immediate safety threat. It showed a calm father asking what law he had broken while standing near his wife and children. The third problem was the timing of the tone shift. Multiple recordings captured the same pattern. Before identification, the sergeant acted forceful and dismissive. After officers realized the father was a sitting federal judge, the tone changed fast. That did not help the department at all. It made the scene look exactly like what the family later alleged. Officers were comfortable pushing past legal limits until they realized the person in cuffs had the knowledge and position to hold them accountable. The family filed a formal complaint quickly. They did not rely on public outrage alone. They preserved the videos, identified witnesses, requested records, and built the case the right way. The complaint focused on unlawful detention, improper use of restraints, unequal treatment in a public space, and the failure to articulate reasonable suspicion before escalating. It also pointed to the emotional impact on the children, which mattered because departments often try to treat family harm as secondary when it is part of the real damage. Then came the legal side. The father's team prepared a federal civil rights action against the department and the officers involved. The claim was straightforward. Police cannot detain and restrain people in a public park over a vague complaint without specific facts supporting the stop. They also cannot turn lawful questions into justification for escalation. The family argued that the officers acted first and searched for legal cover afterward. Based on the sequence, that claim had weight. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. The sergeant was placed on administrative leave, while footage reports and dispatch records were reviewed. Another officer on scene was removed from field duty during the inquiry. The supervisor was not accused of causing the stop, but his response became part of the review because investigators wanted to know why supervisory intervention happened only after the detention had already gone bad. The department tried the usual public language at first. They said they take all complaints seriously. They said the matter was under review. They said they are committed to professional policing. That kind of statement buys time, but it does not fix footage. Then more facts came out. Witness statements supported the family's account. Video angles matched each other. The timeline was consistent. The father had asked clear legal questions. The officers had failed to identify a concrete offense before using handcuffs. The children had been present the entire time. The tone shift after identification was obvious. By that point, The department was no longer deciding whether the stop looked bad. It was deciding how much damage it could contain. The sergeant's employment did not survive it. He was terminated after the review concluded that the detention was not supported by a properly articulated legal basis and that his escalation decisions violated department policy. The termination was not presented as a political sacrifice. It was framed as a policy and judgment failure. That wording mattered because it meant the department could not defend the stop on the merits. The father later made a public statement, and it cut directly to the issue. He said his title was never the point. The Constitution was supposed to protect his family before the officers knew who he was. He said the real question was how many families without recordings, witnesses, or legal knowledge had already been treated the same way and never managed to prove it. That statement landed because it turned the story from one family's case into a broader indictment of how vague complaints and officer assumption can become unlawful detention. The case also pushed for reform. The family called for stricter detention review standards, mandatory body camera preservation in all public contact complaints, and better training on reasonable suspicion, public space enforcement, and recording rights. Those reforms were not abstract. They were tied directly to what happened in the park. For viewers, the lesson is simple. Stay calm. Ask if you are being detained. Ask what law officers believe applies. Do not physically resist. Record if local law allows it. Keep your hands visible. Try to get badge numbers, unit numbers, witnesses, and timestamps. Do not argue in circles. Make officers define their actions clearly. That helps in the moment, and it helps even more later. This case started with a family eating lunch in a park. It turned into a detention because officers treated discomfort and assumption like legal authority. Then the entire thing collapsed once the facts had to stand on their own. That is how bad stops unravel. Not because officers suddenly become honest, because footage, timing, and clear facts leave them nowhere to hide. If you want more stories about abuse of authority, legal accountability, and the moments where power flips back to the people who know their rights, subscribe and stay with the channel.